The simplest way of defining trauma is it's an experience we have that overwhelms our capacity to cope.
That was Dr. Dan Siegel. He's a clinical professor of psychiatry at the UCLA School of Medicine. He's also co-founding director of the Mindful Awareness Research Center. And he's just skillfully summarized the painful experience of trauma. But why does trauma overwhelm our capacity to cope? What specifically happens in the brain that sets us up for this kind of overload?
Fundamentally, every part of the brain, more or less, is affected by trauma. The right brain lights up more, the left brain is shut down more, the back of the brain is more hyperactive, the front of the brain becomes less active, the connection between different parts of the brain gets messed up. What happens is that the brain sort of gets frozen in a state of paralysis or of hyper-alertness, and that involves multiple brain structures.
You just heard Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. He's the world's leading expert on the treatment of trauma. And as he said, trauma doesn't discriminate when it comes to the way that it takes over the brain. And that phenomena, this factor, is key to understanding why trauma controls our clients' lives. Hi, I'm Dr. Ruth Basinski, a licensed psychologist in the state of Connecticut and the president of the National Institute for the Clinical Application of Behavioral Medicine. And coming up in this session, we're going to dig deeper into how trauma lives inside of the brain. We'll look at the hormonal response to trauma and what that does to the brain and to the body. We'll also look specifically at the parts of the brain that sets off protective responses in the face of trauma. The part that sets off the fight, flight, and freeze response. Plus, you'll hear about the healing capacity of the integrated brain, and you'll get specific ways to help clients create more integration in their brain. Last but not least, we're going to get into epigenetics. We'll talk about specific ways that our genes can actually get turned on and off. Now to start, I want you to take a moment to think about what makes trauma so powerful. In other words, what is it about an intense experience that makes it so damaging? Got it? Now compare that to this idea of what creates the single most powerful aspect of trauma.
Inescapability. The inability to change things around. The feeling of paralysis. Actually, paralysis is central. Like, oh my God, there's nothing I can do. I'm done for. This is it. That feeling of total helplessness.
These feelings can get ramped up when a client is missing one important element, the resources to deal with them.
An experience for one person may not be traumatizing to another. And I think that's really exactly what the research is telling us, is that we have to understand what this situation means for this particular individual to see whether the potential for it to be traumatizing turns it to it being actually traumatizing. So people can have different contexts where something would be traumatizing for you wouldn't be traumatizing for me. So for example, if I were a race car driver, right, and used to doing figure eights, which I remember seeing as a kid, and those are those horrible situations where they literally cross over as fast as they can, and they're constantly getting hit and flipped over. And that's what I do for a living, right? So then if I was driving, and my car got hit in a highway and I flipped over, I'm used to what to do, right? Because it's my profession. Whereas if you were driving and that were to happen, of course it would be traumatizing. How do you cope with the idea an oil tanker has flipped your car over and over and over again? So that can overwhelm you. You don't know what to do. You feel helpless. In this case, it's a life-threatening situation. It's different from anything you've ever experienced before. And in that sense, it overwhelms your ability to cope.
So is there anything that might help someone keep from feeling overwhelmed? What would need to happen for the brain to be able to cope with the situation? Now, Dan is quick to remind us that there's still so much that we don't know about the brain, but he will say this.
For the brain to cope with a situation, It needs to take in stimuli that are coming in from the outside world and then allow the vision of what's going on, the hearing of what's going on, the smell, the taste, the touch, the five senses, along with what's going on in the sixth sense, the body. All of that input is basically energy and information flow through the nervous system, and then it has to take it and do something with it.
So to pick back up on Dan's analogy, the energy and information flow of, say, a car accident is totally familiar to someone who's been a race car driver. The screeching of tires and the spinning or flipping of the car, even the reflex to protect the head or to not tense up upon impact. Having this kind of familiarity allows the person's different input systems to stay coordinated. It allows for their emotional response to stay balanced. And Dan calls that integration. The flip side, of course, is that for the average person, so someone who's not a race car driver, for the average person, the thought of all that input, the screeching, the spinning, the flipping, and so on, well, Dan says that would simply overwhelm their capacity to encode these things into memory. So it comes down to having the ability to cope with incoming stimuli.
Oh, sorry.
Perfect example. That's not the first time a light has fallen on our set, but I record a lot of video projects in our studio, so I'm more prepared when things occasionally go wrong. Okay, let's look further at what's happening when we're under stress. Now, of course, that requires looking back at the brain, but we also need to look at the hormonal response to stress and to trauma.
Areas of the brain involved in responding to stress means something significant is happening, include the release of cortisol from the brain. Well, it's actually not from the brain. It's a cortisol releasing hormone is released from the brain, and cortisol is actually going out throughout the system. And so you've got ACTH, adrenal corticotropic hormone, coming out, and inside the kidneys you're having also adrenaline being released, cortisol is being secreted, and it's affecting the brain, in the brain itself, but that's going into the body, it's affecting metabolism. It's a really good thing.
Now, people often think of cortisol as the enemy, but that isn't always the case. You see, it's important to note that cortisol is actually what we need to mobilize. It's what helps you get up in the morning. So when we're facing a threat, it's cortisol that revs up our metabolism so that we can become more alert, more engaged, and ready to go. But when it comes to what's happening to the brain during the stress response, cortisol is only one piece of the puzzle.
But now I'm also secreting things from my kidneys, above my kidneys, the adrenal glands, like adrenaline. So ad is above and renal is the kidney. So above my kidneys, I'm now secreting these substances that will have a very different effect on my brain than cortisol.
Did you catch that? That's really important because this is the setup for the trauma experience. During trauma, cortisol and adrenaline have a direct impact on brain function. Here's what happens.
Cortisol will actually shut off the way my hippocampus functions, but adrenaline will increase the way my, for example, amygdala will function. And so I'm going to increase the laying down of certain kinds of memories with adrenaline, but I will decrease the integration of those memories because the hippocampus has receptors on it that respond to cortisol and shut it down.
So you've got two hormones being released, and each one has a very different effect on the brain.
And if it's sustained for long periods of time, of course, cortisol can be toxic to the way the brain functions and grows, whereas adrenaline is going to increase the laying down of emotional memory.
So now that we've got a sense of how hormones impact the brain and the body during trauma, let's take things from a different angle. You see, the body has this amazing built-in response mechanism that stretches back to very early in our evolution, and that's the fight-flight response. Now, we'll get into the third response, the freeze response, in just a few moments, but for right now, Let's get a sense of what's going on in the brain as it gears up the body to either fight or flee in the face of trauma.
I think the first thing that happens in the brain is that the person orients to the predator, whatever the predator may be, and kind of examines, how close the predator is and how likely the predator is to affect the individual. And this happens in the brain at the level of the superior colliculus, which is deep in the brain stem. That really helps us to orient and figure out where the predator is.
So when it comes to facing down any kind of threat, the brain stem is our first line of defense. It's what sets off the really quick, protective responses that can help us during trauma when we don't have time to think about it. Thinking happens at a higher level of the brain, and it's too slow for an emergency response.
I think what's really important to realize about the brain stem is that you have direct connections from the back part of the eye, the retina, to the brain stem. So if you see something, even if you're not aware of it, that can be transmitted to the brain stem immediately, that information. But you have to act, right? You have to be ready. The millisecond you're threatened, the organism has to be ready to defend itself. And so I think this is why very primitive structures in the brain stem are critical in these fast defensive responses. So say you see something and you may not even be aware of it, but the retina in your eye has already transmitted it to the brain stem, to an area called the superior colliculus, which is right next to this area called the periaqueductal gray that's involved in defensive responses.
Now I'd like to highlight something that Ruth just said. That area, known as the periaqueductal gray, that area plays a crucial role in how our clients relate to the world.
The periaqueductal gray, which I like to call the cockroach part of our brain, the most primitive danger detection part of the brain, is always lit up when you're a traumatized person. How it is lit up specifically determines whether you have a more hyperactive or a more dissociative response. Basically, on the most elementary level of your survival brain, you are set to always be alert for danger and bad things happening.
As Bessel said, this area primes the nervous system to fight or flee. But there's one more response that we've yet to address, and that's the freeze response. The freeze response is one more way that the nervous system protects us in the face of threat. Ruth Lanius gets into this a little bit more.
And so the next, adaptive step is then a freezing response. And so this is feigning death. The person actually can't move. The muscles are in a frozen state. And now we don't just have that sympathetic, that fight-flight activation. We also have what's called parasympathetic activation, the parasympathetic nervous system, which is sort of the brake to the fight-flight nervous system that kind of breaks it all. And so we get equal activation of both of these nervous systems when the person freezes. And this is again mediated by the periaqueductal gray in the midbrain. So deep in the brain, this part of the brain has a specific part that actually mediates freezing responses. So that again connects to muscles and connects to higher parts of the brain to get this more rest or the brake nervous system online. And then we know, if this is not enough to, get the predator to move away, then the person shuts down completely.
So heart rate drops, respiratory rate drops, people can even stop breathing. In this state, people's muscles become limp and their metabolism shuts down. What's also happening during the freeze response is that endorphins are released. This is important because it helps the person to temporarily enter a state of no pain.
And so I think when you're experiencing horrific trauma, this is an adaptive state to be in because, you don't feel pain, you're no longer aware of your surroundings, and you shut down.
So Now let's narrow our focus even more and hone in on the 3 specific brain networks: the default mode network, the salience network, and the executive network. Trauma's impact on each of them can have dire implications for our clients.
For example, the default mode network, which is a network that really helps process self-relevant information, helps us to know what we're feeling inside, helps us to process our own memories, and helps us to think about the future. And I think when we think about our traumatized clients, all 3 of these functions are often very impaired. And then we know the salience network, which is a network that helps us to figure out what's most important in our environment to respond to, is very much affected by trauma.
So now here's the thing. For people who've been traumatized, there's so much in the environment that can feel threatening. So for them, trying to figure out the most important or threatening thing to pay attention to can feel virtually impossible.
And then there's also a brain network called the central executive network, and that's a brain network really involved in helping us plan, helping us think, and engaging in in concentration and in focused attention, which of course is also very much affected by trauma, as we know. And we now have some findings showing that especially symptoms of dissociation, so zoning out, not being able to be in the present, really affects the functioning of that central executive network, our ability to focus, our ability to plan, which I think makes a lot of sense clinically. That, if you're zoned out, if you're not able to be in the present, you can't engage in sustained attention, or, your short-term memory is going to be affected, your ability to plan is going to be affected.
Not only that, but symptoms of a dissociation also impact the brain's executive network. So we're talking about symptoms like zoning out and not being able to stay in the present. Now, when that happens, short-term memory can be affected as well. And last but not least, when trauma affects the central executive network, it can keep our clients trapped by taking away their ability to problem solve. Now, Ruth just touched on dissociation, and so I want to stay with that just a moment or two, because some studies suggest that peritraumatic dissociation, that's when people dissociate at the time the trauma occurs, peritraumatic dissociation is the biggest risk factor for developing post-traumatic stress disorder. So why would that be? Well, Dan Siegel has a hunch, and we'll get into that in a moment. But first, we should lay some groundwork, because a big part of the answer has to do with the link between dissociation and disorganized attachment. In addition, we also need to look at how dissociation occurs and why it also might set someone up to be more likely to develop PTSD.
And you may know that developmental attachment research has shown that disorganized attachment is at least one of the precursors to people being filled in their lives with dysfunctional forms of dissociation. Dissociation, remember, is a process that most human beings, probably 85% of people have. So it's not bad, it's just what we have. It's the ability to get absorbed in something and then exclude other things. So there's the normative kind of dissociation, but pathological dissociation is different. It seems to build on normative dissociation and then fragment our ability to have a continuity of consciousness. So this is just my thoughts, and it could be completely wrong. But for me, what dissociation does and why some researchers say it's the biggest risk factor for developing PTSD after experiencing a potentially traumatizing event, because after all, remember from the studies, 20% of people who experience a really harsh event develop PTSD, 80% won't. So, which is interesting because that's a number similar to the number of people with disorganized attachment. So that's just kind of interesting. It may be a coincidence, or it may be the source of their dissociation that makes them at risk.
Okay, so let's pause for a moment and let that sink in. 20% of people who experience a traumatic event go on to develop PTSD. And according to Dan, a similar percentage of people also have disorganized attachment.
So whatever the cause, we don't know, but let's just assume that hypothesis that's been proposed is true. Why would that be true? Well, I think what happens is when you have stimuli coming at you from an experience, you need to take it and place it within all sorts of aspects of your nervous system, and dissociation fragments that ability. Literally, I believe the mechanism of dissociation is for memory is the hippocampus is blocked from processing things. For example, cortisol can do that, but even divided attention can do that.
So here's essentially what happens when someone experiences the kind of fragmentation of memory that Dan's talking about. When someone's unable to integrate memory, in other words, when we're not able to take the separate pieces and put them together in an explicit form, well, that can wreak havoc on a person's internal sense of coherence.
So the sense of self is profoundly assaulted with dissociation. Dissociation itself becomes traumatizing. So that if you can't rely on your own experiences, then your own sense of self is itself a cause of being overwhelmed by things. And I think this is why, unfortunately, what the contemporary research on attachment shows is that even if you've had secure attachment with a caregiver, but at times are frightened by them, when you have this disorganized attachment, which is a predisposition for dissociation, you have equally as difficult outcomes as someone who's actually not had that secure attachment. So dissociation may be the mechanism, we don't know why that is, but certainly disorganized attachment by itself, with or without a background of security, is actually pretty devastating to a person's coherent development. Then if you say, well, if that's the source of a person's vulnerability, then if you have that person having a potentially, as you beautifully say, an overwhelming event, dissociation will be the response and impaired integration will be the outcome.
So by way of quick recap, in the face of trauma, dissociation may often be the response when disorganized attachment is part of the equation. And as Dan said, the outcome of a dissociative response will be impaired integration. So let's take a closer look now at integration. Impaired integration is one of the hallmarks of a traumatized brain. And this matters because when integration in the brain is impaired, it disrupts our ability to balance the nervous system.
So our nervous system evolved to both support reactions to challenges that were acute, and then to have recoveries that support the health, growth, and restoration. And we link that through evolution with our ability to co-regulate and socialize with other people.
That's Dr. Stephen Porges. He's the creator of the polyvagal theory. And what he just explained is how it should work. We face a challenging situation, but we're able to recover in a healthy way. When this happens, our system is balanced and our brains are primed to integrate the many stimuli that we encounter. We know, however, that isn't always the case. When stress is chronic or we constantly relive trauma, we can struggle to bounce back.
The nervous system is adjusting to those demands without the normal periods of basically recovery and rejuvenation.
An unbalanced nervous system blocks our capacity for flexible, adaptive, stable functioning. And remember, according to Dan Siegel, all of this starts to go haywire in the first place when brain integration becomes impaired.
So, therefore, if that's basically what we know from all the different research studies of trauma in the brain, and if you think of therapy as a way you change the brain, it's a reasonable statement to say the purpose of therapy for trauma is to create more integration in your client's brain.
So before we get into how to do that, how to help clients create more integration in the brain, first, let's get a better sense of what exactly we mean by brain integration.
Brain integration is a term that refers, of course, to the brain, which is an organ in your head that's deeply interconnected with the whole body and the social world. The word integration literally means the linkage of differentiated parts. The outcome of impaired integration, what you would see in the assessment is you see a lot of chaos or rigidity, which are signs of impaired integration. You can have any number of areas for developmental trauma that have been blocked in their growth, such as the prefrontal cortex that links the cortex, the limbic area, the brainstem, the body proper, and the social world together. You can have the corpus callosum that links the differentiated left and right, not well developed. You can have the hippocampus here in the limbic area that takes widely separated areas of implicit memory and links them together. So you can also even take the connectome, many differentiated areas of the brain, how they're connected. And the research shows that developmental trauma early in life, blocks the growth of this integrative brain in terms of functioning as a person didn't have emotional balance. They couldn't think clearly under stress. They had difficulty having mutually rewarding relationships. They couldn't just sit quietly by themselves. You offered to do a body scan and they had a panic attack when they were focused on their body.
Now we're going to be talking about brain integration. And so let's look at the two types. There's vertical integration, where you're trying to make sure that the three levels of the brain are unified. Those three parts are the primitive parts of the brain or nervous system, the emotional parts of the brain, and of course, the thinking parts of the brain. And while we're on the topic of what we once commonly referred to as the triune brain, I just want to say there are some experts who have recently questioned the validity of this three-part model of the brain. We looked into this, and I've talked to a few colleagues, so here's what I'd say. While the triune brain models is starting to be considered perhaps overly simplistic, it still can be generally useful as a way to think about the functioning of each of these brain regions. Okay, so getting back to the topic at hand. So there's vertical integration, which we just went over, but then there's also left-right integration, where obviously we're trying to kind of harmonize the two hemispheres of the brain. Now we're going to look at both of these types of integration, but to start, I want to focus on vertical integration. Because when trauma disrupts or breaks connections between the primitive, the emotional, and the thinking parts of the client's brain, we need ways to help them repair vertical integration. Now, one way to do that is by working with three things in concert.
Working with what I think of as three levels of information processing, which goes along with the three levels of the brain. We do work with cognitions and belief systems that are formed after trauma, which involves the cortex. We have to work with the emotions, especially how to regulate those trauma-related emotions like rage and terror, which has to do with, the limbic system. And then we have to work with the body, because that's where trauma impacts.
So, thoughts, emotions, and the body. That was Dr. Pat Ogden, and she's a pioneer in sensory motor psychotherapy. Now, before we move on, take a moment to think of your own work. Which of these areas are you best at working with? Thoughts, emotions, or the body? And which do you need more strategies for? It's working with those three levels of information processing, thoughts, emotions, and the body, that is key for helping clients facilitate vertical integration. So now let's move on to left-right integration.
And then we also have to work with the left-right and the implicit self that's held in the right hemisphere. So that we work with what isn't conscious, what isn't fully in our awareness. But as Reich said, the body is the manifestation of the unconscious, so that's a natural access route towards accessing the implicit self. One of the main ways we work with the unconscious is to be aware of how it's reflected and sustained through posture, movement patterns, physical expressions, etc. Someone, for example, might be in a posture like this after trauma. We see this a lot with veterans. They're very tight, they're their whole system is prepared to fight. Okay? But they're often not even consciously aware of that. And they go back into their families and their children, and they have these rage attacks because their body is already wired to predispose them to lash out.
So Pat looks at how the client's body is reflecting and sustaining the difficulties that trauma leaves behind. The ultimate goal is to help the client come into what Pat calls the window of tolerance. But first,
the first order of business is that you've got to form a relationship with the client. You've got to elicit their social engagement system, because without that, you can't do anything. So that will help the client feel safe and trusting when their social engagement system is connected with yours. And that has to sustain throughout therapy. Then from there, you can start to begin to access the dysregulation. Okay? Bring it into the therapy hour. Stimulate it somehow, not in a huge way, but enough so that then you can help the person integrate.
So Pat just talked about one more way we can promote integration in our clients, by drawing out their social engagement system through a safe relationship. Here's what this might look like in practice.
I can tell you about working with a veteran who had just explosive rage attacks. He never hurt anybody because he said he could almost feel it coming and he would isolate himself. But he would destroy rooms and furniture and, put his fist through the wall. There was a point in therapy where he felt this rage just surging up through his body. And he said it feels explosive. So he was feeling exactly what he felt when he had those rage attacks. And this is a very important element of therapy, I think. We always want to bring a piece of that symptom into the present moment experience of the therapy hour, because then we can work with it as it's happening.
With this particular client, Pat focused on sensory awareness. She asked the client what was going on for him when he remembered the combat, when he remembered all of those people dying. As the client experienced those memories, she brought his attention to his body, and he felt a surge of rage.
So I said to him, let's stay with that surging and tell me exactly what's going on. And he felt it rising up in his body, and he felt this tremendous urge to lash out. So this has to do with brain integration, because if you have a client mindful, that engages the observing part of the brain. So for this client, I asked him over and over to tell me exactly what he was experiencing, to observe it with mindfulness and describe it to me. And he said he felt it surging up. He wanted to lash out. And I placed a pillow here, and I said, okay, just begin to make that motion, but stay right with me and report to me what it feels like, report the tension, report the sensation. And when you do that, it prevents that reaction, that subcortical explosion that he had experienced so many times. And his brain started to feel the rage and execute that action, what Pierre Genet would call an act of triumph, but yet his cortex was online.
So why did this keep Pat's client from going into an explosion?
Because you're eliciting mindfulness, and mindfulness keeps the frontal lobes online. So as I'm asking him questions and he's reporting to me, that keeps the integration of the brain rather than him kind of dissociating into the subcortical brain. And another very important thing is that it keeps the social engagement system online. He is not alone with this. Like when he would feel the rage and destroy a room, he's in relationship with me. We're socially engaged. So both of those factors, and then working with the body to complete that action, I think were critical in his resolution of the trauma.
For the first time, after that session with her, Pat's client was able to talk about combat without feeling dysregulated. Pat believes that her client felt the effects of a more integrated brain through their work together, and she credits the combination of working with mindfulness and the body, as well as working with his thoughts and his beliefs for bringing that about. Does Pat's story remind you of any of your clients? Perhaps you could take a moment now to jot down a quick note about how this story could help you with one of your clients. Okay, so before we move on, I'd like to leave you with one more thing to think about when it comes to mindfulness and presence and brain change. I think you're going to find this really powerful because, to quote Dan Siegel, your mind can change your molecules.
There are 4 ways you can affect the brain. You can affect the brain's synaptic connections, which are probably affected throughout the lifespan. You can affect neurons that died away. That's true. You can affect myelin. Yes, that's true. And you can affect, the epigenetic controls.
Now, epigenetics. Let's unpack that just a bit. We used to think that you were born with a certain number of genes in DNA and that was fixed. That's just what you had and that was your destiny. Now, you are born with a certain number of genes, of course, but that's not the end of the story. Genes can be turned on and off throughout life, and that's why therapists are so important. And for that matter, it's also why parents, teachers, pastors, coaches, all of us really, why all of us are so important. Any person can make a difference in a child's epigenetic development. So when we're talking about epigenetics, we're very much talking about people's ability to move beyond just what they've inherited through DNA. It's about what we acquire during our own lifetime, and also the changes in genes that we pass on to our children.
It's a little complicated to tease it all apart, but the bottom line is you affect not just synapses, neurons, and myelin, but also the epigenetic regulations that determine how genes are expressed in the brain. Here's the bottom line. Epigenetic impacts of trauma appear to involve alterations in parts of the genome that would otherwise be preventing inflammation. So many of the disorders of stress are disorders of inflammation.
Now, here's where things start to get really interesting, because preliminary studies have identified a big game changer when it comes to preventing inflammatory diseases. It's something we can easily do every day. In fact, maybe you and some of your clients already do it. I'm talking about mindfulness.
Look at, let's say, mindfulness training. Some studies, preliminary studies, have suggested, like David Creswell's study of control study comparing relaxation to mindfulness, shows that only with the mindfulness do you get actually changes in the epigenetic regulation of regions of your genome that will help you prevent inflammatory diseases. And we're talking about things like diabetes or certain forms of diabetes, certain forms of cancer even. Some people are even thinking of Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease. So inflammation, of course, in heart disease, inflammation is a huge thing even when you look at the biome. The composition of living organisms, yeast and other fungi and bacteria in your intestines. These things all affect your inflammatory state. And inflammation may be the common mechanism that leads to these problems. And the brain may participate in a big way in altering your state. After all, if mindfulness corrects epigenetics that helps decrease your likelihood of getting inflammatory diseases, then you can imagine stress, and trauma being one, would make it more likely so you're going to have these inflammatory diseases. So that's probably why Felitti found what Felitti found in the ACEs study.
So before I zero in on that one thing in particular that Dan just said about epigenetics, I want to digress for just a moment about something that Vincent Felitti actually found in the ACE study. And here ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And that was a landmark study. And what Felitti found was, well, 3 main things. Number 1, adverse childhood experiences are unfortunately too common. Number 2, adverse childhood experiences often occur in clusters. And number 3, adverse childhood experiences can contribute to high-risk health behaviors in adulthood. In fact, the higher your client's number of adverse childhood experiences, the higher your client's likelihood of engaging in addictive or destructive behaviors. Not only that, but a high number of ACEs also correlates with a greater likelihood that your client is going to experience depression, heart disease, cancer, or a shortened lifespan. So it makes sense to talk about the ACE study when we're talking, like Dan was, about how experiencing stress and trauma increases the likelihood of experiencing inflammatory diseases. Okay, so let's go back to what I really want to zero in on, though, with regard to what Dan was saying about epigenetics. He mentioned mindfulness as a way of influencing epigenetics. Now, mindfulness is one thing that can cause epigenetic changes, but of course it's not the only thing. Recent research tells us that epigenetic changes are often affected by the length of your telomeres. So, what's a telomere? Well, here's one way to think about it.
So a chromosome is a long length of DNA, and for your cells to stay healthy, they have to unwind and make copies of themselves and then get themselves rewound again. So think about a shoelace with a cap on it. The telomeres are the cap on the twisted set of DNA, the double helix DNA, that keeps it intact. And let's say, just for numbers' sake, you have about 100 of them. They're not genes, but they're protectors of the genes, right? So they're like a cap on a shoelace, right? As we age, the number of our telomeres gets less and less and less. If we have stress, the number of telomeres gets less and less and less. And at some point, the number is so low that when the cell divides and tries to put itself back together in these two new cells that are made, there's not enough telomeres to hold the genetic material intact. So they're not functioning as genes, but they're functioning to protect the genes. And once that happens, your cells get sick and die, and you get sick and die.
So an important thing to note here, long telomeres are what we all want. Having long telomeres means that we have a lot of these gene-protecting units contained in the cap of the shoelace, to borrow Dan's analogy. And yes, it's possible to repair and lengthen shortened telomeres. Here's how.
You can increase this length of the cap with telomerase. So it's telomere, and in biology we say ASE for an enzyme. So it's telomere ACE, but it's pronounced telomerase. So telomerase will repair this shortened set of telomeres, and telomerase will maintain it then. So telomerase is good. You want to talk about optimal levels of telomerase, because actually having too much telomerase can lead to serious problems, and too little telomerase leads to problems. So let's just talk about optimal levels.
How can we achieve optimal levels of telomerase in order to increase the length of our telomeres? Well, Dan says one of the best predictors of optimizing telomerase is what you do with your mind.
So what do you do with your mind that does that? Something called presence. Being aware of what's happening as it's happening is what is the best predictor of optimal telomerase levels. But basically what presence does, we believe, is creates this integrative state of energy and information flow of oneself in one's body and brain and in connection with other people. So the social world and the somatic world, in our view, are all a part of this energy and information field, if you will, that mental presence allows to become integrated. And within integration, you actually alter epigenetic controls, which that's what the research shows. You optimize telomerase levels, so you're changing an enzyme. We now know what you do with your mind and what you do with your relationships changes the molecules of health. It literally changes enzymes. It literally improves your telomeres. It literally optimizes the non-DNA histones and methyl groups that are helping prevent inflammatory disease. So I mean, if you would have told me this, Ruth, 15 years ago, probably when we first met, Dan, one day you'll be quoting the science that says, your mind is changing your molecules. Maybe we would have said, well, it probably does, but gosh, we'll never know that. We now know it for sure. Your mind is not just your brain. Your mind is both your whole body and your relational world. And yet those have this self-reinforcing loop that you can create your own habit. So the great news about that is you can work with a professional and we as professionals can work with people to say, look, you can actually change the way you live your life. And this is something, I know people with severe trauma are some of the most challenging to work with, but they're also some of the most rewarding people because, for example, dissociation is a curable condition. I hardly ever use that word, but I've worked with enough people now to know you can actually work to take these non-integrated states that are continually creating chaos and rigidity in a person's life, and you can help them so that, yes, they'll optimize telomerase, they'll change epigenetic controls, they'll improve cardiovascular function, they're going to help their immune system function well. These are all proven outcomes of when you become more present, and their relational world is going to become more rewarding. So that's fantastic. What a privilege it is to be alive at this moment, to help people facilitate this deep set of integrative processes in their life.
What Dan just said really touched me. And to paraphrase him just a bit, what a privilege it is to do the work that we do right at this moment in time. So without further ado, let's talk to Drs. Ruth Lanius and Ron Siegel. We'll be teasing apart what we just heard from the experts. We'll also get into how brain science can help lift the burden of blame that our traumatized patients often put on themselves.